Rancher paid $25 for a worthless desert property. A starving horse appeared and changed everything. The year was 1824, and the heat in the Southern Territories did not just burn, it judged. It stripped the flesh from the earth and the hope from a man's soul. Samuel Price sat on the splintered bench outside the trading post of Fort Solitude, his boots coated in the gray dust that seemed to cover the entire world. He was a man eroded. 3 years ago, Samuel had been a man of substance in the East, a cattleman with a future. Then came the fever that took his wife, followed by the bad investments, the journey west, and the robbery that left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a bitterness that tasted like copper in his mouth. He counted the coins in his palm. $26, that was the sum of a life. "Going once," the auctioneer's voice rasped, cutting through the stifling afternoon air. A small crowd had gathered near the livery stable. They weren't bidding on fine horseflesh or prime grazing land. They were laughing. The object of their amusement was a deed being held up by the sweating auctioneer, a parchment yellowed by time and neglect. "The Devil's Anvil," the auctioneer announced, wiping his brow. 40 acres of pure nothing, rocks, scorpions, and enough heat to cook a lizard on a stone, located 3 miles past the dry wash. "Do I hear $5? The crowd chuckled. The Devil's Anvil was legendary in Fort Solitude. It was a patch of desert so desolate even the cacti struggled to root. It had been sold and abandoned 3 times in the last decade. $5 for a place to die?" a drunken trapper shouted, eliciting a roar of laughter. Samuel looked up. He didn't see a joke. He saw a reflection. He was 40 acres of nothing. He was a dry wash where hope used to flow. $25, Samuel said. His voice was raspy, unused to speaking with authority anymore. The laughter died instantly. Heads turned. The auctioneer squinted, shielding his eyes against the sun. "Did I hear 25? "25, Samuel repeated, standing up. He walked forward, his gait stiff. "For the deed and the right to be left alone." "Sold to the stranger with the dusty coat," the auctioneer yelled quickly, terrified the madman might rescind the offer. As Samuel handed over his coins, leaving himself exactly $1 to his name, a heavy hand clapped his shoulder. It was Caleb Thorne, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. Thorne was a man built of gristle and greed, owning everything green within 50 miles. "Price, isn't it?" Thorne sneered, chewing on a tobacco plug. "You just bought yourself a grave, son. There's no water on the anvil. My boys scouted it years ago, not a drop. You'll be buzzard meat by the next full moon." Samuel pocketed the deed. He looked Thorne in the eye, his gaze empty but steady. "Then at least I'll die on my own land, Thorne, which is more than I can say for the men you've run off yours." Thorne's eyes narrowed, but Samuel turned away. He bought a shovel, a pickaxe, a bag of beans, and a small barrel of water with his last dollar. He walked out of Fort Solitude into the shimmering heat, pulling a small handcart behind him. He didn't look back. The Devil's Anvil lived up to its name. It was a flat, brutal expanse of hard-pan clay and jagged shale, bordered by a ridge of red rocks that looked like the teeth of a skull. There was no shade, save for the shadow of the rocks when the sun dipped low. For the first 2 weeks, Samuel existed in a fugue state of labor. He built a lean-to against the rock face using scavenged mesquite wood and a tarp. He cleared stones, piling them into walls that enclosed nothing. It was busy work, the kind meant to keep madness at bay. But the thirst was a constant companion. He had to walk 3 miles back to the settlement's public trough to fill his barrel, a humiliating trek that drained his energy. Every time he walked into town, the whispers followed him. The madman of the anvil. He tried to dig. He chose a spot near the center of the property, where a patch of weeds looked slightly less dead than the others. He dug until his hands blistered, popped, and bled. He dug until he hit bedrock that rang like a church bell under his pickaxe. Dry, Dust. Nothing. By the fourth week, Samuel's supplies were dwindling. He sat by a small fire made of dried sagebrush, staring at the stars. The silence of the desert was absolute. It was heavy, pressing against his eardrums. "Why am I here?" he whispered to the constellation of Orion. "Just to end it?" He had a pistol in his pack with one shot left. He had considered it. It would be quicker than dehydration. The next morning, the wind shifted. It brought the smell of sulfur and decay. Samuel dragged himself out of his lean-to, shielding his eyes. Something was moving on the horizon. It wasn't a man. It was a staggering skeletal shape, weaving through the heat haze like a ghost. Samuel grabbed his rifle, though he had no powder for it, using it as a club. He waited. The figure drew closer. It was a horse, but calling it a horse seemed generous. It was a rack of bones draped in a hide the color of dirty sand. Its head hung so low its muzzle nearly brushed the rocks. Its mane was a matted tangle of burrs and thorns. There was no saddle, but raw, weeping sores on its back suggested it had been ridden hard and discarded. The animal stopped 20 feet from Samuel. It didn't have the strength to run. It raised its head, revealing eyes that were clouded with the milky film of near death. It let out a sound that wasn't a whinny, but a dry, rattling groan. Samuel lowered the rifle. He saw the ribs protruding like barrel staves. He saw the cracked hooves. "You and me both, partner," Samuel muttered. "You came to the wrong place for charity." He turned to go back to his shade. He had half a barrel of water left to last him 4 days. If he shared it, he would have to walk to town tomorrow, and he wasn't sure he had the strength. The horse groaned again, and its front knees buckled. It collapsed into the dust with a heavy thud. Samuel froze. He looked at the heap of misery. He remembered the feeling of the auction, the laughter of the crowd. He knew what it felt like to be discarded because you were no longer useful. He cursed softly, grabbed a tin cup, and dipped it into his precious water barrel. The horse couldn't lift its head. Samuel had to kneel in the dirt, soaking a rag in the water and squeezing it into the animal's mouth. "Easy," Samuel whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't choke on it. It's expensive stuff." For 3 days, this was their ritual. Samuel Price, the man with nothing, pouring his life force into a creature that had less than nothing. He named the horse Dusty, a name as unimaginative as it was accurate. On the second day, Samuel noticed the brand on the horse's flank. It had been seared over, an ugly scar trying to hide the original mark. Someone hadn't just lost this horse. They had stolen it, ridden it into the ground, and then tried to erase the evidence before leaving it to die in the waste. "Someone hurt you bad, didn't they?" Samuel murmured, picking burrs out of the mane while Dusty lay panting in the shade of the lean-to. Samuel had given up his own shade for the animal. On the 4th day, the miracle happened. Samuel woke up to a wet nose nudging his shoulder. Dusty was standing. He was shaky, his legs trembling like newborn saplings, but he was upright. Samuel laughed. It was a rusty sound, painful in his dry throat. He poured the last of the grain he had meant for his own porridge into a flat rock. Dusty ate it with desperate gratitude. As the weeks turned into a month, a strange transformation took place. As Dusty grew stronger, Samuel found a new reservoir of strength within himself. He wasn't just surviving for himself anymore. He had a dependent. He had a purpose. He walked to town to do odd jobs, mending fences, chopping wood, to buy oats and hay. The townsfolk noticed the change. The madman looked less like a ghost and more like a man on a mission. One afternoon, Samuel was repairing the stone wall near the western edge of his property. Dusty, now able to trot, usually followed him like a dog. But today, the horse was acting strange. Dusty was near a cluster of large boulders at the base of the red ridge, the most barren, sun-baked corner of the lot. The horse was pawing at the ground, tossing his head and snorting. "Come away from there, Dusty," Samuel called out. "Snakes like those rocks. Dusty ignored him. He pawed harder, sending puffs of dry clay into the air. He dropped to his knees, sniffing the cracked earth, then stood and pawed again. Samuel walked over, wiping sweat from his eyes. "What is it, boy? You smell a coyote?" Dusty nudged Samuel with his nose, then looked pointedly at the ground. He pawed again, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump. Samuel looked at the ground. It was bone dry. But he remembered the old stories his grandfather told him about wild mustangs in the high deserts. They could smell water deep underground, water that humans couldn't sense. "You think there's something down there?" Samuel asked. "Thorne's men said this land was dry as a bone." Dusty snorted and stamped his hoof, his eyes bright and demanding. Samuel sighed. He fetched his pickaxe. "If I die of heat stroke digging a hole in a rock pile because a horse told me to, put it on my tombstone." He dug for 2 days. The ground was unforgiving. He broke the handle of his shovel and had to carve a new one from mesquite. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, Samuel was 6 feet down. He was exhausted, his hands raw. He looked up at Dusty, who was peering over the edge of the hole, waiting expectantly. "You're a liar, Dusty," Samuel wheezed. "There's nothing here but hell and rocks." He raised the pickaxe for one final angry swing. He drove it down with all his remaining frustration, aiming for a fissure in the bedrock. Crack! The sound was different. It wasn't the dull thud of stone on stone. It was a hollow crack, followed by a hiss. Samuel pulled the pickaxe free. A puff of cool air hit his face. He fell to his knees, scraping away the loose debris. The rock had fractured. He put his ear to the crack. Deep below, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of rushing movement. It wasn't just a spring. It sounded like a river. With trembling hands, he widened the hole. He drove the pickaxe down again and again. Suddenly, a jet of water shot up, muddy at first, then clearing to a crystalline transparency. It bubbled over his boots, cool and sweet. Samuel Price sat in the mud at the bottom of the hole and wept. He scooped the water into his hands and drank. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He climbed out of the hole, soaked and laughing. Dusty trotted over and nuzzled his wet shirt. "You knew," Samuel whispered, burying his face in the horse's neck. "You crazy, beautiful beast, you knew." It wasn't just a seep. It was an artesian aquifer trapped under the pressure of the rock shelf. Once released, it flowed. Within a week, Samuel had dug a channel. The water filled a natural depression in the rocks, creating a pool. The desert responded with terrifying speed. Dormant seeds, sleeping in the dust for decades, burst open. Grass, green and vibrant, began to fuzz the edges of the stream. Birds appeared out of nowhere, swallows, hawks, and quail. The Devil's Anvil was dead. The Dusty Well Ranch was born. News of water in the desert travels faster than a brush fire. Samuel brought his first wagon load of fresh water into Fort Solitude 3 months later. He wasn't selling it. He was trading it. But the sight of Samuel Price, clean-shaven, wearing a new shirt, driving a wagon pulled by a sleek, muscular buckskin horse, stunned the town. He stopped at the general store. The owner, a sour man named Silas, stared. But it was Silas's widowed daughter, Sarah, who came out from the back. Sarah Jenkins was a woman of 30, with hands rough from work and eyes that held a quiet sadness. She had lost her husband to a mining accident 2 years prior and had been living in the shadow of her father's cruelty since. She had been the only one who never laughed at Samuel. Once, she had slipped an extra measure of beans into his sack when he was counting pennies. "Is that the same horse?" Sarah asked, walking up to Dusty. She reached out and Dusty lowered his head, blowing softly into her palm. "Same horse, ma'am," Samuel said, removing his hat. "Just needed a little faith. And water." Sarah looked up at Samuel. "They say you found a river." "Dusty found it," Samuel corrected. "I just did the digging." He looked at the crates of vegetable seeds stacked outside the store. "I need seeds. Corn, squash, beans, and alfalfa." "That will cost," Silas grunted from the porch. "I have money," Samuel said quietly. He placed a small pouch of gold dust on the counter. He had found it in the pan while cleaning out the sediment of his new creek. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Sarah began to gather the seeds. "I can help you choose," she said softly. "Some of these won't grow in the heat, water, or no. You need the native strains." Over the next few months, Sarah became a frequent visitor to the ranch. At first, she claimed she was just checking on the seeds. Then, she brought cuttings from her own garden. The romance between them was not a wildfire. It was like the growth of the ironwood tree, slow, deep-rooted, and resilient. One evening, as they sat on the porch Samuel had built, watching Dusty graze in the new pasture, Sarah spoke. "My father wants me to marry the banker in Tucson," she said, her voice tight. Samuel felt a cold stone settle in his gut. "And what do you want?" "I want to be where things grow," she said, looking at the green oasis they had cultivated. "I want to be where miracles happen." Samuel reached out and took her hand. It was calloused and warm. "There's a lot of work to be done here, Sarah. It's a hard life." "I've never been afraid of work, Samuel. Only of emptiness." They were married a month later, under the shade of the first cottonwood tree that had grown tall enough to cast a shadow. But happiness in the West draws predators. Caleb Thorne had watched Samuel's rise with seething fury. The Devil's Anvil was surrounded by Thorne's land. Samuel's water source was drawing wildlife, and potentially cattle, away from Thorne's drying mud holes. More importantly, Thorne recognized the horse. It was a blistering Tuesday when Thorne rode onto the property, flanked by 4 armed riders. Samuel was in the field hoeing the corn. Sarah was by the well washing clothes. Dusty was grazing near the house. "Get off my land, Thorne," Samuel said, leaning on his hoe. He kept his voice calm, but his knuckles were white. Thorne laughed. "Your land? You might have the deed to the dirt price, but that horse you're keeping, that's stolen property." Samuel stepped forward. "I found him dying in the desert. He didn't have a brand that wasn't burnt over." "That's because the thief tried to hide it," Thorne lied smoothly. "That's a Circle T stallion, stolen from my north pasture a year back. I'm here to reclaim my property. And since you've been harboring stolen goods, I reckon the law might see fit to confiscate this land as compensation." It was a transparent frame-up. Thorne didn't want the horse. He wanted to break Samuel and take the water. "You left him to die," Samuel said, realizing the truth. "You rode him into the ground and dumped him because he was lame." "Prove it," Thorne snarled. He signaled his men, grabbed the horse. One of the riders uncoiled a rope, dusty ears pinned back. He remembered these men. He remembered the smell of Thorne. The rider spurred his horse forward, swinging the lasso. "No!" Sarah screamed, dropping her laundry basket. Suddenly, Dusty didn't run away. He charged. With a scream of primal rage, the buckskin stallion launched himself at Thorne's mount. It was a blur of teeth and hooves. Dusty wasn't a farm animal in that moment. He was a wild creature defending his herd. He slammed his chest into Thorne's horse, knocking the smaller animal sideways. Thorne fell, hitting the dust hard. His pistol skittered away. Dusty reared, his hooves flashing in the sun, striking the ground inches from Thorne's head. The other riders hesitated, their horses spooked by the fury of the stallion. Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the shotgun he kept leaning against the fence. He leveled it at the riders. "Get!" Samuel roared, "or I bury you where you stand." Thorne scrambled backward, terror in his eyes as Dusty snorted, froth flying from his mouth, ready to strike again. The great horse stood over Thorne, a guardian demon of the desert. "Call him off!" Thorne shrieked. "He ain't mine to command," Samuel said coldly. "He's his own master, and it looks like he's got a grievance with you, Caleb." Sarah ran to the house and came back with Samuel's pistol, standing beside her husband. Thorne scrambled to his feet and ran to his horse, vaulting into the saddle. "This isn't over, Price," he yelled, but his voice cracked. "It is," Samuel said. "If you ever come back, I won't stop him next time." Thorne and his men rode off in a cloud of dust. They never returned. The story of the killer horse of Dusty Well spread through the territory, and no one dared cross the property line of the Price family again. The years that followed were kind, though not easy. The West does not give gifts without demanding sweat in return. The Dusty Well Ranch became a sanctuary. It was a crucial stopover for wagon trains heading to California. Samuel and Sarah sold water, vegetables, and hay. They never price gouged. They remembered what it was like to have nothing. The plot twist of their lives came not from violence, but from life itself. 2 years after the confrontation with Thorne, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy named Jacob and a girl named Hope. The romance of Samuel and Sarah wasn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments. It was Samuel coming in from the fields to find Sarah teaching the children to read by the light of an oil lamp. It was Sarah bringing cool water to Samuel and rubbing the ache from his shoulders. They built a real house made of adobe and timber, with a porch that looked out over the green valley they had created from dust. And always there was Dusty. The horse aged. His golden coat turned white around the muzzle. He moved slower. He no longer pulled the plow or the wagon. He was retired, the king of the ranch. The children adored him. Little Jacob would sit on Dusty's back while the old horse grazed, and Dusty would walk with infinite care, treating the boy like fragile glass. One evening, as the sun set painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, Samuel and Sarah stood on the porch, watching the twins braid flowers into Dusty's mane. "We did good, Sam," Sarah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We got lucky," Samuel replied. "No," Sarah corrected him, turning to look into his eyes. Her face was lined now, but more beautiful to him than the day they met. "You were kind. That wasn't luck. You gave your last cup of water to a dying beast. That's why we're here. That's why I'm here." She kissed him, a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of years of shared burdens and shared joys. "I love you, Samuel Price," she whispered, "and I you, Sarah, more than this water, more than this land." Time is the one thief no rancher can hold off. It was 1842. 18 years had passed since Samuel bought the Devil's Anvil. Samuel found Dusty one morning lying under the great cottonwood tree near the spring. The horse didn't try to get up. His eyes were calm, the milky cloudiness of old age returning, but the fear was gone. Samuel sat in the grass beside him. He didn't cry this time. He simply stroked the velvet nose that had nudged him awake all those years ago. "You tired, old friend?" Samuel asked softly. Dusty let out a long, slow breath. "You rest now," Samuel said, his voice thick. "You did your job. You saved me. You saved all of us." Dusty closed his eyes, and with a final shudder, the spirit of the desert stallion slipped away, returning to the wind. Samuel buried him right there, beneath the tree that drank from the water Dusty had found. He carved the marker himself from a slab of ironwood. "Here lies Dusty, the horse who found water and gave a man his life back." Samuel Price lived to be an old man. He saw his children grow and take over the ranch. He saw the railroad come through, miles to the north, bringing a new world with it. But every evening, until the day he died, Samuel would walk to the grave under the cottonwood tree. Travelers would ask him about his success. They asked how a man with $25 bought the best ranch in Arizona. They expected a story about shrewd business or gold or gunslinging. Samuel would just smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "If anyone tells you a piece of land or a soul is worthless," Samuel would say, "tell them about the starving horse in the desert, and tell them about the fool who believed that kindness could dig a well where logic saw only dust." When Samuel finally passed, they found his journal on the bedside table. The final entry, written in a shaky hand, read, "I came here looking for a place to end my life. Instead, I found a creature that wanted to live more than I did. We saved each other. In the end, That is the only story that matters, not the gold, not the land, just the water shared between two broken things. The Dusty Well Ranch still stands in the local legends of the borderlands, a testament to the bargain made between a man and a horse, paid for in water and sealed in love.